Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Enhancing Operational Durability, looking at CPS 230 and 234 and exploring the ways these prudential standards can be incorporated into your particular organization's BAU. My name is Michael Nelson from LexisNexis Regulatory Compliance. I'm joined today by my colleague and friend Zabeeulla from TMLabs. The recording has commenced, so at the end of today's proceedings, we'll be happy to share the deck and a copy of the recording if you'd like one. And of course, if you'd like a little bit more information about either myself or Zabi, please feel free to raise your phones to the screen now. There are QR codes that will take you to our respective LinkedIn pages, and there you'll find everything you need to know about both of us. There are QR codes scattered throughout the content, so when you see them again, please feel free to raise your phones to the screen, and we'll go from there. So, a little bit of background before we start. We're going to be exploring, as I mentioned before, the prospective implementation of CPS 230 and its relationship with the current CPS 234. We're going to do a little bit of background about, of course, LexisNexis and TMLabs, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper into some of the underpinnings of the relationship between these two prudential standards, and then finally have a look at how that all works within the TMLabs environment. We'll have a Q&A, of course, and we'll finish it off with some closing remarks. If you do have any questions over the course of the next hour or so, please feel free to put them in the chat, and there'll be hopefully an opportunity to respond to those today. Failing that, we'll get back to you. So, we'll go for about an hour. As I mentioned, the chat is the best place for questions. And as I mentioned, we'll get back to you when we can. And of course, these QR codes, again, there's a lot of really interesting information in there. There's some free tools, there's some free checklists. And at the end, there'll be an opportunity if you'd like to get in touch with TMLabs to arrange a demonstration. So first things first, LexisNexis. For those who don't know, LexisNexis has been around in various guises for the best part of the last 200 years. Predominantly, the LexisNexis element of the broader RELX group has focused on legal research. And for those 200 years, we've provided guidance on case law and legislation to people who work in the legal profession around the world. About 8 years ago in Sydney, we formed the view that the kind of people who were good at interpreting legislation and case law for the benefit of the legal profession would be equally good at providing interpretations and commentary on legislation and prudential standards and regulation for people who work in risk and compliance. Now you can see that we have an enormous footprint around the globe. We have a significant number of resources on which to draw, and over the course of time, those resources have been variously deployed, starting in Australia, moving into New Zealand. We're now in a number of different jurisdictions around the world. But you can see that what we have behind the scenes is a wide variety of different institutions, different professionals, different specialists that we can pull in to make sure the content that we provide at LexisNexis for the risk and compliance solution is comprehensive and current and comprehensible as well. One of the key drivers in the uptake of LexisNexis regulatory compliance, I think, is apparent on the screen at the moment. Over any given year in Australia, there are around 5,000 individual legislative and regulatory reforms. Similar sorts of numbers on a sort of per capita basis in New Zealand. One of the key issues that we see people facing is not simply understanding what your obligations are today. You can potentially get those from a panel firm, or you can build up a register yourselves. But it's this element, which is how do you then interpret and respond to regulatory change? How do you see whether it affects you or not? How do you see if it does affect you, what the rest of the organization needs to do in order to get up to speed? And how do you then track that and maintain a sense of what your obligations are today in this constantly shifting landscape? And that's where the regulatory compliance solution comes in. Relying on the people that we talked about before, we've created a series of registers that are translated out of parliamentary draftees into easy to navigate topics, looking at the kind of processes of what compliance looks like, what controls might look like, what risks might be apparent in the event of a breach, and translated into a way that anyone coming to the obligation can make sense of it. We then, in terms of regulatory change, look at all of the nation's parliaments. We track north of 300 different regulators and peak bodies in Australia. So when things do shift, we don't simply tell you that they've shifted. We look at which particular elements of which particular registers might potentially be affected or will be affected in the event that, for example, a bill becomes law or a new prudential standard goes live. And so we provide you with not just over the horizon scanning pinpointed to particular elements in your registers, but let you know as milestones roll out, as elements of particular legislation take effect at each milestone, what those changes mean for you. Obviously, the obligations set out what your responsibilities are, what action you need to take. How do you then make sure that information's been properly digested and responded to? And where you can get more information. Of course, we don't simply give you an obligation. We provide you, as you'll see in Zabi's demonstration later, we provide you with clear insight into the primary sources, pinpointed down to the section level of where we're sourcing the information that informs the obligation that we've written. Now, we use a number of different resources to populate this content. All of the people who write our content are legally trained, from the in-house teams to our consultant writers to our legal experts. They all play a role in making sure the content leaves us accurate, and then as regulatory change flows through, it's updated in an accurate and timely fashion. The last piece in the puzzle is, of course, getting this into your hands, and that's where TMLabs comes to the fore. Through an API, we can put our content directly into the TMLabs system, which means that you can then use that as the foundation stone to build out your broader governance, risk and compliance obligations. You can see as regulatory change flows through what it means to you. The obligation owner can see what's happened. You can link risks, you can link policies, you can link a whole variety of internal workflows. And importantly, as we'll see today, being able to digest that and report on that is also really easy within TMLabs. And finally, of course, in this current age, as risk and compliance teams get leaner and leaner, you can see here that what we do is provide you with, amongst all of the other information and the timeliness of the reporting and so on, we provide you with the capacity to redeploy certain members of your team from information gathering and information dissemination to actually doing the job of compliance people, making sure that the policies, the procedures, the internal structures that you have are being properly effected. Now, enough about LexisNexis. Let me pass you on to Zabi, who can tell you a little bit more about TMLabs.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for that. Good morning, all. I'm Zabeeulla Mohammed. So, with an unwavering focus on high-quality outcomes for our cyber and risk customers, TMLabs accelerates digital transformation using the ServiceNow platform. We deliver fast adoption-driven MVPs, minimum viable products, phased best practice transformations, and architecture-led back-to-the-box engagements. We are an Australian-based elite ServiceNow pure-play services and technology partner with consultants based in New South Wales, Victoria, and Queensland. Our dedicated integrated risk management practice simplifies the journey towards security incident response and threat intelligence, vulnerability response, advanced risk management, and regulatory change management, and automation through playbooks and integrations. Our extensive client portfolio encompasses a wide range of industries, including government and public sector, banking and finance, construction and engineering, energy and utilities, healthcare and life sciences, logistics, and mining and resources, to name a few. So with that introduction, I would like to hand it over back to Michael. Thank you, Michael. All yours.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Zabi. So I think one of the first places to start is broad. What we won't be doing today is going into an enormous amount of pinpoint detail. I suspect that most people on the call will be familiar with what at least the intent of CPS 230 and 234 require of you. So what we're going to do is put it into context, because I think that one of the key elements of this particular piece of legislation, or regulation rather, is less about the prescriptive nature, although obviously that's key, but it's more about the interesting cultural drivers that this kind of regulation, common to what's happening in New Zealand under COFI or in the UK with the Code of Conduct, is trying to achieve. So the first thing to look at is what APRA is looking for when it talks about operational resilience. And it really is looking at how well you as an organisation can respond to these bumps and shocks that we're continuing to experience on a more and more frequent basis when it comes to your normal operating environment. Now, I think one of the good things that may have come out of the pandemic, although clearly pandemics are genuinely bad things, was the sense that the comfort that we have as organizations around the way that we operate was massively shifted. And you can see the timing of when CPS 234 first came out as a concept is clearly allied to that. We may anticipate future pandemics. We simply have to. We can see what's happening in Africa at the moment with Mpox, for example. Likewise, we can see the effect of conflicts, regional conflicts that now, because of the massively interconnected nature of the way organizations operate, have massive spill into the global operating environment. Obviously, what's happening in the Ukraine has had significant influence on the way that food is dealt with, food issues are dealt with in Africa. We can look at the way that the conflict in Gaza has spilled into the rerouting of significant amounts of shipping around the Cape of Good Hope, simply because the Red Sea is an increasingly dangerous place to sail. And of course, there's the competent view around cybersecurity and the constant battle that people who work in InfoSec have around staying ahead of the game when it comes to the constant probing of weaknesses that anyone who's connected to the internet has to face. It's also worth looking at what APRA is trying to achieve with these two prudential standards a little bit more broadly, because as I mentioned, things like COFI, things like the Code of Conduct, things like CPS 230 are interesting approaches that can potentially go beyond what the financial services sector is looking for. Other industries, other organizations beyond the remit of APRA are also looking for guidance around how to build in this kind of operational resilience, because it's not just the financial services sector that's affected. A few years ago, when I was looking for a new car, the wait time on the car, and it was a mid-level, mid-range sedan, was significantly impacted, not because the cars weren't being built, but the screens that were built by a third party, those screens couldn't be manufactured in time because there were supply chain issues with key elements of the screens. So I could have bought a car, I could have gone on my business, but the cars simply weren't available because third-party suppliers had run into issues. And so the key elements of what CPS 230 is trying to achieve, again, coupled and supported by CPS 234, inform strategies that organizations need to look to and embrace around how best to anticipate these kind of future shocks. Rely on technologies like TMLabs to be able to incorporate what CPS 230 is looking for and create an environment that works across the entire organization. Because it's, again, this isn't one of those elements that simply is unique to, say, your audit and accounting team or your people and culture team or your work health and safety team. It's common across the organization. There are key elements in each of those areas that will need to be addressed when it comes to looking at operational resilience. And finally, the tools that we provide through the content that LexisNexis offers and the mechanisms and the reporting streams that TMLabs can provide that allows you to not only respond and identify to potential risks, but also when those risks do occur, how those can be addressed quickly and easily. So let's have a look at CPS 230. The first thing is back in 2022, when the world was young and fresh, APRA was looking for a new prudential standard that could apply to the financial services sector in Australia that allowed them to begin to create an environment that would allow them to better manage operational risk, look at BCP and outsourcing service providers as well. Clearly, what we've seen over the course of the last maybe 20 years, 30 years, is an increasing acceleration into technology and what that has meant for the regulators, and we'll talk about this in a moment, is that they need to be anticipating your future needs and your future operational environment and provide you with guidance and standards to adhere to make sure that your business and operations aren't affected when things, as they often do, go wrong, often due to circumstances beyond our control. So, none of this will be new to everyone on the call, I suspect. CPS 231 and 232 on the 1st of July next year will be superseded by 230, as will a couple of the specialist elements, the super 231 and 232 and health as well. And the idea is to create a universal environment that means that when things do occur, you've got the tools and the resources and the game plans in place to respond properly and effectively to it. And I think one of the really interesting elements is that because it's such a cultural shift for organizations, and because there's a universal application to this, it's a great opportunity for different elements of the financial services sector to work together to understand what you're all doing, how you're responding to this, looking at scenario testing, for example, about what would happen if this element went down for a day, or this element went down for a week, or this supplier suddenly found themselves unable to provide the services that we rely on. And so you can begin to almost gamify this process. And then when these potential outlier do occur, you've got a system and a schedule and a process in place to respond to it. And of course, for those people paying attention, CPG 230 was recently-ish released as well. And again, that's a great resource to draw on. So the other key element of operational resilience is InfoSec. Now, CPS 234 has been around for a while. But what's really interesting is the relationship that it shares with CPS 230, because what it really does is underpin a key element of what CPS 230 broadly is trying to achieve. Minimize the likelihood of impacts, maintain environments where your data is safe, your data is kept confidential, content is available on an as-needs basis due to and subject to the various processes that you put in place. But one of the key things that I think that we see in both instances is ultimately it's the board that's responsible. Now, what that means for the board is that they will be leaning heavily on their senior management and on the processes and workflows and internal triggers around content change to make sure that when information shifts or responsibilities move, that the board is properly apprised of the effect of these changes. So again, we won't dwell on this too much. I'm sure everyone on the call knows what CPS 234 requires of you. Defines roles, making sure that you've got capabilities commensurate with the kind and size of organization that you are. Make sure that you've got controls in place that regularly test the various elements of your InfoSec environment. And of course, making sure that APRA is notified in a timely fashion according to the nature of the change in the event that there is a security incident. Now, as I mentioned before, when we're talking about change like this, it doesn't happen in isolation. And I think APRA has recognized that the environment in which the financial services sector operates has obviously changed significantly. What that's flowed through is a review of the prudential standards that we all rely on, a look at the reporting standards that we look at, and the supporting guidance as well to make sure that the content that we look to when we're building up environments like that expected of us in relation to 230 and 234 are not just fit for purpose today, but are fit for purpose going forward until such time as we see another step change in the way that we all cooperate and do business. So within the modernized prudential architecture that APRA is looking at, there are 5 key pillars, 4 of which are generally applicable: governance, risk management, recovery and resolution and reporting, 1 of which is banking and finance related, the other one broadly relates to business operations. CPS 230 and 234 fall within the risk management environment. Now, what does that look like in LexisNexis? Well, I'm glad you asked. So for those people familiar with the LexisNexis content, one of the things that we first started doing when we built our content was look at a topic and then look at the key elements of potentially an enormous variety of different pieces of legislation and regulation and standards that would inform that. Now, what that meant on the one hand was that you had a really clear, holistic view about what your obligation was in a given environment. One of the things that was harder to unpack was when you were called upon in relation to maybe an internal audit or an external audit, when you were asked to demonstrate that you were compliant with a section of the CIS Act or a section of the Corps Act or a paragraph from a prudential standard, how you could then point that back. Now, obviously, there's ways and means to do that, but when it comes to this, what we've done is taken a slightly different approach. We have two distinct modules, one that relates to operational risk, the other one that relates to information security, and the obligations within those modules are linked directly to particular paragraphs and particular areas within those two prudential standards. Obviously, there's other supporting material as well, which is key to a proper understanding, but it's designed to make your reporting internally and externally, those reporting processes, a whole lot more easy. So with that, what I might do is pass over to my colleague Zabi so you can see how this looks within the TMLabs environment.
Thank you, Michael.
Zabi, are you ready for me to stop sharing?
Yes, please.
No worries.
Bear with me, guys, for a moment. Are you guys able to see my screen now?
Loud and clear.
Thank you. Thanks. So, good morning again, everyone. So, what you see here is a ServiceNow-based application that TMLabs has created or worked upon and built, and that's completely based off of APIs. And what we do is we consume the modules that you subscribe to in LexisNexis, and we bring it and show it in your ServiceNow IRM module specifically. So as you see here, there's only two modules that we are subscribed to. We have built it in such a way that we only showcase two of these for the sake of the demo or the webinar. So for now, let's focus on operational risk management. So the way these have been arranged is in a parent-child hierarchy. So basically what it does is the module comes in first, and then it ties up to the associated topic, and then topic is tied up to the associated obligations, and then obligations definitely will in turn have quite a lot of, may or may not have a few or more sub-obligations. So this is how the hierarchy is set up in LexisNexis, and we bring in the exact same hierarchy into ServiceNow and tie it up to the IRM data model. Let's have a look at operational risk management first, and then look at one of the obligations called roles and responsibilities. I'll be opening up it in another screen or another tab. So if you see, this is an obligation that is coming in from LexisNexis. The information that you see here on the form is very informative in terms of what's the source, what's the reference for that specific obligation, what its name, that's roles and responsibilities, what's the type, and the source ID, synonymous to that of reference. And then there is a parent, which means what's the topic or the module that you subscribe to, which relates to this obligation. And then we have a few other fields that you could make use of, and you can also specifically assign it to an owner or a person, meaning a person who can take ownership of this obligation, meaning making sure that this obligation is compliant in the organization. And then moving on, we have jurisdiction. It basically states what jurisdictions do these obligations apply to. And then we have a few fields called descriptional questionnaire, basically the short description of the obligation posed as a statement. And exactly same applies to the description directional as well. And then we have practical guidance, which is a comprehensive understanding of what an organization should do in order to be compliant with this obligation. And then we have consequence, that talks about the potential consequences of being found to be in breach of an obligation, in this case, the roles and responsibilities. And then moving down further, then we have a field called remedial action, which talks about how an organization is required to behave in order to remain compliant with this specific obligation. And then we have compliance sources or compliance source, which contains the information or the range of legislation and ancillary materials from which the practical guidance, remediation, and consequences are drawn. So basically, these are the links which you could click on and then go in and have a look at the comprehensive view of where this obligation is derived from. Then lastly, we have historical note. that talks about or captures where the changes made to a particular obligation are summarized, and also each node in the system is retained for about 12 months. So this is how an obligation looks like when it comes in from LexisNexis. It comprehensively encompasses everything that LexisNexis provides. There's nothing that we're missing. However, the additional capability of ServiceNow IRM module is how you could leverage this specific obligation to make sure that you're compliant within your organization. What you could do is basically derive some of the remedial actions and pick the remedial actions that are very much inclined towards your organization, or the remedial actions that are mandatory to be fulfilled by your organization. And then you could create them as control objectives. What control objectives are basically the controls that you would like to enforce in your organization. And it could be for any unit, any business unit, any department, or any part of your organization in order to be compliant with this or with this obligation. And if you scroll up, I also wanted to show you there is a field called compliance score with a color coding, which talks about the amount of, this is how much you are compliant with this obligation in your organization. I'll show you in a minute how that is calculated, but for now, let's assume that is 71%. So if you scroll down to the control objectives, each of these control objectives has a compliance score, and definitely I'll be opening one of those control objectives to walk you through how that score is calculated and how it rolls up back to your obligation. So that is the control objective. Here we have an entity type. So basically, this is a terminology that ServiceNow uses to bifurcate or divide in application of these control objectives or any other IRM related data model into entities. So the first one is we have an entity called business unit, and this business unit could have multiple entities called IT, finance, product structure, and to name a few. And then if we move ahead, what happens basically is once this control objective is associated to an entity type, there is a control record created against each of the entities that is present in an entity type. Basically, these are the entities: IT, customer support, finance, and product management. It could be hundreds, it could be tens, it could be one, two, three. What it does is each of these control is assigned to a control owner in that specific entity. So IT control owner here is David Liu. David Liu receives a control attestation, and David Liu has to fill a control attestation saying that we are compliant with this control in our organization in the IT department, with necessary evidence stating that you are compliant. Once they fill in the information and the status is compliant, and some of the departments or some of the business units may say that we're not compliant due to such and such reasons for Natasha or for Rob, and then that control comes back as non-compliant. Now, average of this is the compliance score for the control objective, and average of all of these control objectives is the compliance score for your parent obligation. So how it works is if I scroll down, I see that there are also some sub-obligations. So the average would be the average of this plus the average of this divided by 2. So it is a cumulative average of child obligations, that is cumulative average of sub-obligations and control objectives associated with this specific obligation. So that's how ServiceNow makes sure that you are compliant, and it also alerts you if you are not compliant and if you would like to have a look at. So now let's move on to a dashboard, how we could leverage a dashboard and we could put on some reports and widgets with a basic dashboard, which will allow you to look at what your performance is in terms of compliance and non-compliance of operational risk management or information security or any module, so to speak. So basically what you see on the screen is a CPS 230 and 234 compliance dashboard that we've built. So these are point-in-time reports that we have built in for specifically getting in the controls. And out of those total controls, how many compliant controls do we have? How many non-compliant controls do we have? Then we could get some trends by month and then compliance percentages. Now, we have built this dashboard to be a little dynamic, which is interactive. What you could do is pick one of these sub-obligations, not this obligation as such. You can pick an obligation as well if you want. I'm just picking up one of these sub-obligations, which talks about responsibilities of senior managers, which falls under roles and responsibilities of operational risk management. So this is where the drop-down for obligation is. As you can see, adding or selecting that particular obligation will allow you will allow the reports to filter specific to that particular sub-obligation. Meaning, if you are a board member and if you like to see your compliance posture for your obligations or your regulatory compliance controls that have been applied at your organization, definitely this is the best way to do it. However, having said that, we could scale this dashboard to whatever requirement that we have, not only and not limited to operational risk or information security. It could be other modules that you subscribe to LexisNexis, or it could basically be covering every module that you're subscribed to LexisNexis on a single dashboard as well. And then you have compliance percentage. For this, the fact that you have no non-compliant control, which is why everything's hunky-dory, nice and clean, green, and then you're good with responsibilities of senior managers obligation, at least in your organization level. So, and again, if you want to, dig down deeper, you can just click on this link and it'll take you to another screen wherein it shows you what are the controls that are non-compliant, what are the controls that are compliant. Those are the 23 non-compliant controls. If you want to have a look at what went wrong, if you want to have a look at the evidences associated, and then take a course of build a course of action in order to avoid that bottleneck down the line and make sure you're compliant in your organization for that specific control. So going back, so that's how you would bring in the control of the obligations into LexisNexis, from LexisNexis into ServiceNow, sorry. And then you will be able to measure those obligations against your organizational controls and make sure how compliant you are and measure your organizational compliance posture using custom-built ServiceNow TMLabs LexisNexis integration application. And now I would also like to show you an additional module that will capture or that captures the regulatory information that comes in from LexisNexis. So basically it brings quite a lot of information from LexisNexis, not limited to modules. It also brings in mandates, sub-mandates, topics, and then one of them is alerts. So alerts are basically regulatory alerts. Any regulatory alert, any regulatory change or anything published by LexisNexis in LexisNexis API would be coming in to ServiceNow as a regulatory alert. Again, this is an out-of-the-box application called Regulatory Change Management, and we are binding this integration into an out-of-the-box table called Regulatory Alert. So what happens is whenever there is a regulatory alert, it is consumed as a regulatory alert in ServiceNow, and quite a lot of information about alert description, very comprehensive, what that alert means and how it impacts the obligations. And also LexisNexis sends us the IDs of the obligations that are potentially impacted due to that alert. So ServiceNow also relates that alert back to the obligations that are impacted, or the obligations that are affected, or that requires modification, or you might have to revisit if you're looking at this alert if it applies to your organization. What you could basically do is you could perform an impact assessment on these alert, go to your obligations that are impacted, that are associated in that alert, revisit if there are any control objectives or if there's any compliance status, how much compliance are you currently, and if there's anything new that you would like to introduce. Let's say if the regulatory alert wants you to apply a new remedial action, which also means that you'll have to apply a new control in your organization, you could definitely go in, create that control, send out the attestation to that specific owners of that control, be it a business unit owner or be it a department owner. And then that when that attestation comes back, it'll roll up to the compliance score of that particular obligation. So basically, what it means is you can review your obligations that are impacted or that are affected via the alert impact assessment. And then finally, you can close the alert make sure that you are now in compliant with the alert that has come through. So in that way, you are abreast of everything, all of the information that is coming in from LexisNexis, and making sure that your organization is compliant with that. So that's how ServiceNow binds or combines the information that comes in from LexisNexis, consumes the information that comes in from LexisNexis, binds that into ServiceNow IRM module out of the box, and make sure that we as an organization are compliant, and also shows you the compliance posture, which allows you to monitor and measure your compliance scores and your compliance percentages. So that's that. With that, I would like to hand it back to Michael. That was a quick and short demo of how IRM, ServiceNow IRM incorporates LexisNexis information via LexisNexis TMLabs integration application. Thank you, Michael. I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you, Zabi. That's a brilliantly elegant solution to I think one of the key problems that organizations have, particularly in the financial services space, which is there's increasingly more to worry about. We've got a couple of very active regulators, in fact, a few very active regulators in the space, and finding a way to distill the content into its key component parts, such that the elements that people need to be apprised of, whether that's as a board member or senior management or people with key areas of responsibilities that are generating the data that flow into those dashboards. I think it's a really elegant solution to a very complicated problem. Now, in terms of Q&A, as is often the case when we have large groups of people, people tend to be shy. So if anyone would like to pose a question, you're more than welcome to join us with a question. I must confess, I've got a couple of questions. When it comes to building the dashboards and generating information for the purposes of reporting to senior management or board, I think one of the interesting elements that CPS 230 is looking for is in relation to identifying critical operations. So when we're talking about those controls you've got, is there a way to build in additional fields so that you can determine whether an operation is critical or not, or whether you can add different tolerances and track the different critical operations and their different tolerances as well?
Yes, yes, Michael, that's a good question. Definitely, we can. Control already has a field called status, whether that's a critical, that'll allow you to already add or tag what type of control that is, and definitely you will be able to report on any field that you create on top of what's there out of the box. Yes, that is a possibility.
Fantastic. And the other point, and I think this is, again, it comes to that critical element, which is it's not enough to be compliant. You need to demonstrate that you're compliant. I think as organizations gear up for July next year, one of the things that might give senior management board some comfort is being able to track the trends in relation to adoption of this. Is that something that's achievable, where you can take point-in-time snapshots and then demonstrate trends?
Yeah, again, another good question. Absolutely possible. That's out of the box. We could build a dashboard that takes snapshots at point in time from a historical to the current, and based on that, you can also predict how far you could go, and it'll allow you to determine the bottlenecks and resolve. Definitely possible.
Brilliant. So it also allows you to do some horizon scanning of potential. Well, it makes the organization more operationally resilient when it comes to adopting their operational resilience credential standard. Yeah,
it does. Absolutely. That's a good point. And it also allows you to predict, and also allows you to put some thresholds wherein if you would like to reach, when you have reached that threshold, it will notify that, hey, you've reached a threshold where in terms of measuring that historical current to the future.
Mm-hmm.
So you can build in a feature wherein you get notified whenever there's a threshold, or whenever there's a drop beyond which you do not want that drop to go. So yeah, there are different types of notifications that you could build into that dashboard as well, based on the requirement. But yeah, completely possible. The opportunities are Quite a few, myriad.
Yeah, yeah, not necessarily endless, but at least it's a long list.
Yes, it is.
Brilliant. Now, let me throw it open to the floor or the virtual floor. If anyone does have any questions that they'd like to raise now, of course, please feel free. Of course, if they do come to you afterwards, as you're sitting at home tonight thinking that was a terrific webinar, I should have asked this, again, please get in touch with either Zabeeulla or myself through LinkedIn or contact our respective organizations directly. So, with a little bit of time up our sleeve, let's move to some closing thoughts. So, I mean, from my perspective, I think that this is, on the face of it at least, not only just a significant challenge for organizations, um, but there are some significant benefits that flow to it. And I think one of the challenges is akin to the challenges that organizations are facing when it comes to things like, well, previously, modern slavery, currently the introduction of ESG reporting, IFRS 1, IFRS 2, which I anticipate we might see through the ASRS, maybe later this year. I believe that the privacy reform bill that was going to be brought to Parliament in August has now been moved to September. We'll see when and if that lands and what flows from it. But I think that there is a significant body of work that I think was perhaps uncovered with things like modern slavery and will be further extended when it comes to the adoption of this particular all these prudential standards and ESG reporting. And that is building in structures internally that will allow you to determine what metrics you're tracking, allow you to determine that the people who are providing the different, often quite different sources and sorts of data that will feed into this reporting process can do it in a consistent manner. And I think that the key to getting that process underway is understanding what the underlying principles are of operational resilience. So it's less about ticking a box. It's less about saying, yep, we've got a document that says this, and more about looking at the way that your organization functions both between teams and also the way that those teams deal with organizations beyond the walls of your organization. So looking at third-party suppliers and so on. I think that we've all seen instances where organizations have done extraordinarily well in particularly, for example, the cyberspace, where we've seen the lead agency in a cyber breach has maintained solid defenses, but it's when they've gone out to a third-party supplier and relied on them that weaknesses become apparent. In a way, it's as part of this process of looking at that interrelationship between organizations and third parties. It's almost akin to the kind of tiered approach that you would see in modern slavery, where tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, it maps out into a significant number of organizations, all of whom play either a minor or a significant role in the way that the central organization conducts itself and is able to function. And that flows into that second point, is that while it's an APRA regulation, and while predominantly it looks at what the organization does as sort of its operational BAU, that idea needs to be communicated across the entire organization. There might be elements of the organization that may not even necessarily be familiar with APRA and what it does, but nonetheless, they're going to be part of this process and part of understanding that they play a role in the delivery of critical functions that the organization provides. And finally, as part of that, it's important to get buy-in. It's important that everyone in the organization understands what's being required of them, that they can't be excluded from the process. They need to be brought in and brought up to speed on what the organization is looking for. And that needs a cultural shift in some instances. I think organizations naturally default to silos. And that's where something like CPS 230, where its key function is to get across the silos and make sure the whole organization is part of this process. And to do that, it needs to have start from the ground up and make sure that everyone's bought into not just what they have to do, but why they have to do it. Zabi, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you, Michael. So from my perspective, what ServiceNow LexisNexis application that TMLabs has built does is it allows you to manage and monitor regulatory and compliance posture, meaning not only via the obligations that you see as a record, but also via the dashboard. If you have a board member, if you have a CIO or a CRO who could just go onto the dashboard and have a look at what the posture is and what are the bottlenecks that are not allowing you to move forward to be 100% compliant, or maybe to reach your goal in terms of compliance of regulations. Definitely, this application allows you to do that. And then what it does is, instead of you getting information from LexisNexis in silos, you get to seamlessly integrate your obligations into ServiceNow IRM, wherein your ServiceNow IRM application may also have your organizational risk management in there. So what the application allows you to do is it brings in the obligations from LexisNexis into ServiceNow, and then you can tie up those controls back into your organizational risks as well. So meaning it seamlessly integrates into the IRM, as well as the benefit of that is ServiceNow being a single system of record, you'll be able to access both your organizational risk as well as your controls that are coming in from LexisNexis, the controls that are coming in as part of the LexisNexis obligations. So it is a great opportunity if you have ServiceNow to integrate with LexisNexis. And then finally, with regulatory change management, it allows you to assess and reevaluate your existing obligations whenever a regulatory change comes in. Again, this is automated. There's nothing that you have to do in terms of manual for the regulatory change or the alert to come in. The only part what you have to do is the impact assessment, which obviously you'll have to review the regulatory alert and make sure that whether that is compliant or whether that is implied to your organization specifically or not. So with that being said, the application that we have built is also ServiceNow certified. It's out there on the store, and it is also certified by LexisNexis. We are a partner with LexisNexis, and we keep upgrading the application based on the family upgrades that ServiceNow releases, and we are supporting that, as well as to the point that Michael asked if there is any possibility of customization or adding any changes to the controls to track business criticality or critical business services and any other parameters, so to speak. Definitely that is possible, and feel free to reach out to us. We would be happy to help you in that regard as well. So thank you. Thanks. Back to you, Michael.
Thank you, Zabi. Look, I think that's a really really important point, is that the way that this broad and sometimes nebulous idea of operational resilience can actually crystallize into an environment that is informed by us and then managed and monitored and maintained by you, I think is a really important step to helping organizations get closer to not just compliance with 2.2.3 and 2.3.4, but also more broadly beginning to have a sense of not just what other risks are that are available to them, but also that having clear lines of communication and clear management protocols in place to manage and address those risks preemptively, if possible, but quickly and proactively in the event that these risks do arrive. Really appreciate everyone's time and attention today. Thank you very, very much for joining us. If you'd like to have a demo of what you've seen today on TMLabs, please feel free to raise your phone to the screen, and I'm sure that Zabi or a colleague of his will be more than happy to run you through not just what we saw today, but also some of the other elements that TMLabs offers. If you'd like to download one of our free checklists and tools, again, have a look on the QR link on the right-hand side, or you'd like to visit the LexisNexis regulatory compliance site, we would love to hear from you. This is a difficult and challenging project, even for organizations that are blessed with resources. we'd like to be able to help you where we can. But I hope you got something out of today. Again, appreciate your time and your attention. We look forward to hearing from you in the future. All the very best.
Thank you. Thank you all.